On January 9, 2026, U.S. Coast Guard boarding teams reportedly climbed the deck of a crude oil tanker in international waters. The vessel was carrying Venezuelan oil and, according to reports, sailing under a Russian flag. Within hours, the ship was under U.S. custody. Moscow called it piracy. And if you're watching the diplomatic theater, you're missing the shipping ledger. Because this isn't about one tanker. It's about whether the United States can physically enforce its economic rules in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and what happens when Russia decides that protecting oil shipments is worth the risk of a confrontation at sea. I'm Professor David O'Brien. I've spent 20 years in international political economy and maritime energy risk, focused on sanctions enforcement and shipping insurance, and today I'm going to show you what the headlines are missing. Because what reportedly happened this week isn't a one-time interdiction, it's a precedent. It signals that the U.S. is willing to board, seize, and redirect tankers on the high seas if those tankers are moving sanctioned oil, regardless of what flag they fly or how far from U.S. waters they operate. That's physical control of the shipping lanes. And the moment you establish that precedent, every insurer, every ship owner, every trader, and every rival power has to recalculate risk. Russia has to decide whether it protects those shipments. Insurers have to decide whether they can cover vessels that might be seized. And all of that recalculation happens fast, and it moves prices before a single barrel of oil actually stops flowing. This is analysis, not personal financial advice. But if you want to understand why energy costs might spike again, or why the Atlantic is becoming a contested zone, you need to understand the mechanics of what just happened and what comes next. In the next few minutes, I'll show you the 3 levers that decide whether this stabilizes or snaps. Here's the rule that governs everything in energy geopolitics. If you can enforce shipping, you can enforce economics. Not through diplomacy, not through agreements, but through physical control of the routes, the vessels, and the cargoes. For decades, the U.S. enforced sanctions mostly on paper. Treasury publishes a list of sanctioned entities. Banks refuse transactions. Insurers refuse coverage. It works because most of global trade runs through the dollar system and Western financial infrastructure, but it has limits. If a tanker is owned by a shell company, insured by a non-Western firm, financed outside the dollar system, and sailing under a flag of convenience, paper sanctions don't stop it. The oil keeps moving. The system leaks. So this week, the enforcement went physical. By early January, reports emerged that U.S. Navy and Coast Guard assets were positioning in the Caribbean and the Southern Atlantic. On January 8th, according to reports, the first Venezuelan-linked tanker was intercepted south of Puerto Rico. On January 9th, a Russian-flagged tanker was reportedly seized in deeper Atlantic waters. By January 10th, Moscow issued a formal protest, calling the seizure a violation of international law and an act of piracy. According to reports, a member of the Russian Duma stated that the U.S. was engaging in state-sponsored theft, and that Russia reserved the right to protect its commercial vessels. That's not diplomatic noise. That's a signal. Russia is framing this as illegitimate, which means it's preserving the option to respond. Here are the numbers that matter. The tanker reportedly seized on January 9th was carrying approximately 750,000 barrels of Venezuelan crude. According to shipping analysts, the vessel is an older tanker class registered under the Russian flag, but owned through shell companies with ties to Russian logistics firms and Venezuelan state oil operations. The boarding reportedly took place well into international waters. That distance signals reach. If you can board a ship that far out, you can board a ship anywhere in the Atlantic. That's the precedent. And since the start of 2026, according to reports, at least 3 tankers have been intercepted or seized in this corridor. 2 were smaller vessels flagged under registries of convenience, but the Russian-flagged tanker is different. It forces the question, what happens when the flag belongs to a nuclear-armed rival power that has explicitly said it considers the seizure illegal? Let me break this into 3 levers. Lever 1, enforcement capability. This is about tracking, legal authority, and operational reach. If the U.S. can reliably intercept tankers in the Atlantic, it changes the game. Lever 2, the shadow fleet system. This is about how ships evade sanctions through flags, registries, and shell ownership. Evasion has costs, higher insurance, higher risk, fewer willing partners, and those costs get priced in. Lever 3, rival deterrence posture. This is about Russia's next move. Does Moscow quietly accept the seizures? Does it provide naval or air escorts for future tankers? Every one of those choices changes the risk premium and the willingness of commercial actors to move oil through contested waters. Start with lever 1. What interdiction really means. Most people hear sanctions enforcement and think of paperwork and frozen bank accounts. This is enforcement at the physical layer. The U.S. has access to global vessel tracking systems and intelligence assets. Any tanker moving through the Atlantic is visible. The U.S. claims jurisdiction under domestic law, sanctions violations, money laundering statutes, drug trafficking laws, and international legal frameworks. When a tanker is identified as carrying sanctioned cargo, it can be tracked, boarded, and diverted under U.S. authority. The crew is detained, the cargo is impounded. Legal proceedings can take months. Here's what most coverage is missing. Interdiction in international waters is legally contested. The U.S. frames it as lawful because the warrant is tied to violations of U.S. law by entities subject to U.S. jurisdiction. But other nations, especially rivals like Russia and China, frame it as extraterritorial overreach. That legal dispute doesn't stop the boarding, but it shapes how other nations respond. If Russia believes the seizure was illegal, it frames any future protection of its flagged vessels as defensive, not aggressive. The seized tanker is reportedly in U.S. custody. The cargo is frozen. The crew is being held. The legal process to resolve ownership and potentially sanction the entities involved could take months, but the signal is immediate. Every other tanker owner, every other insurer now knows if you move Venezuelan oil under a Russian flag, you risk losing the ship, the cargo, and potentially facing criminal charges. Now, lever 2, shadow fleets and flag warfare. A shadow fleet is a network of tankers that operate outside the traditional Western commercial shipping system. These are often older vessels, purchased cheaply, registered under flags of convenience, insured by non-Western or opaque insurers, and owned through layers of shell companies. They exist to move sanctioned oil without triggering Western enforcement mechanisms. Here's how it works. A tanker operates for decades under a Western flag, insured by a firm like Lloyd's, classified by a society like DNV, and financed through Western banks. When it ages out, or when its owners want to use it for sanctioned trade, it gets sold to a shell company registered in a jurisdiction with weak oversight. The ship is renamed. The vessel loads cargo at a Venezuelan or Russian port and sails to a buyer willing to take delivery without asking questions. The weak point is insurance and classification. To operate legally, a ship needs hull insurance, liability insurance, and cargo insurance. It also needs classification, certification that the vessel is seaworthy and meets safety standards. Western insurers and classification societies won't touch sanctioned trade, so shadow fleet operators turn to non-Western alternatives. Russian state-backed insurers, Chinese firms, or smaller underwriters in jurisdictions with minimal oversight. These alternatives work, but they come with costs. Coverage limits are lower, claims processes are slower, and if a ship gets seized, the insurer might not pay out. That's the dynamic. Shadow fleets work until they don't, and every time enforcement tightens, the cost of operating in the shadows goes up. Ships get seized, insurers get spooked, and the tankers that keep operating have to charge higher fees to cover the risk, which means the delivered cost of the oil rises even if the wellhead price stays the same. Now apply that to this week. The U.S. reportedly seized a Russian-flagged tanker carrying Venezuelan oil. That tanker was part of the shadow system. It was operating under Russian insurance and Russian logistics support. The seizure proves that Russian insurance and a Russian flag aren't enough to protect the cargo. So, what does every other tanker owner do? They demand higher fees, they require higher insurance premiums, or they simply refuse the route. And when fewer tankers are willing to move the oil, the cost of moving it rises, and that cost gets passed through to consumers. Now lever 3, Russia's moveset. When the U.S. seizes a tanker flagged under a neutral registry, there's no meaningful geopolitical response. But when the U.S. reportedly seizes a tanker under a Russian flag, it crosses a threshold. The flag represents sovereignty. A ship at sea under a national flag is considered an extension of that nation's territory under international law. Russia's immediate response was to call the seizure illegal. The Russian Foreign Ministry issued a statement saying the U.S. had violated international maritime law and demanding the immediate release of the vessel and crew. According to reports, a member of the State Duma called it piracy and suggested that Russia should consider escorting commercial vessels. That language is calibrated. By framing the seizure as illegal piracy, Russia preserves the option to escort future tankers, to shadow U.S. enforcement vessels, or to create incidents that raise the cost of U.S. operations. If Russia signals it might protect tankers, either through naval escorts, surveillance aircraft, or public statements, the risk premium in the Atlantic spikes. Insurers see a non-zero chance that tankers could be caught between U.S. and Russian forces. They either refuse coverage or they add war risk premiums that can dramatically increase insurance costs. Ship owners see the same risk and pull capacity. None of this requires an actual confrontation. The signal is enough to move the market. And here's the psychological component. Traders and investors remember escalation cycles. They remember 2022 and the energy price spikes that followed. When they see signs of a new escalation cycle, seizures, Russian protests, threats of protection, or retaliation, they don't wait to see what happens. They price in the worst case immediately. Oil futures spike, refinery margins widen, retail fuel prices rise. Now, the legal question. Under what authority do you intercept a tanker in international waters, and what precedent does that set? The U.S. position, sanctions violations, and money laundering are crimes under U.S. law. If a vessel, cargo, or transaction involves U.S. persons, U.S. dollars, or U.S. territory at any point, the U.S. has jurisdiction. The warrant to seize the tanker is issued by a federal judge. The boarding happens on the high seas, but the legal authority comes from the nexus to U.S. jurisdiction. The counter-argument, which Russia and other nations make, this is extraterritorial overreach. A ship on the high seas is governed by the law of its flag state. The cargo is moving between two non-U.S. ports. The transaction doesn't involve U.S. banks or U.S. persons. The U.S. is projecting its domestic law into international waters. Both arguments have legal merit. Maritime law in contested enforcement situations is murky. What matters more than the legal theory is the practical reality. The U.S. has the capability to board and seize, and it's willing to use it. Russia is disputing the legitimacy, which means it's preserving the option to respond. So why is this an Atlantic pressure point? The Atlantic is an energy highway. Oil from West Africa moves across the Atlantic to U.S. and European refineries. Oil from the Gulf of Mexico and Venezuela moves through the Caribbean to global markets. Liquefied natural gas from the U.S. Gulf Coast moves to Europe. This is one of the most trafficked energy corridors in the world. When enforcement actions happen in a corridor like this, they don't just affect the specific ship that gets seized, they affect every other ship owner's calculation. If I'm a tanker operator, I have to ask, is my ship at risk? If I load Venezuelan oil, will the U.S. intercept me? If I carry Russian cargo, will I lose the vessel? Those questions get asked by every shipping company, every insurer, every trader, and when the answers are uncertain, the default is caution. Routes get avoided, insurance gets more expensive, shipping capacity gets pulled out, and the cost of moving oil through the region rises. A few seizures in a critical corridor can reshape the behavior of hundreds of commercial actors, and that reshaping drives up costs systemically. Now, the three paths forward. Path 1. Expansion of interdiction. The U.S. treats this week's seizures as the start of a sustained campaign. More tankers get intercepted. The enforcement zone widens. The target list expands. The trigger, more seizures. If you see reports of additional tanker boardings in the next 7 to 14 days, especially involving Russian-flagged vessels, this path is in motion. The measurable signal, insurance, and freight pricing. Watch for announcements from major maritime insurers about new exclusions or elevated premiums on Atlantic routes. Watch for charter rate spikes. If rates jump significantly within 2 weeks, that's the market pricing and enforcement expansion. The consequence for Americans, upward pressure on oil prices. The risk premium gets priced into every barrel moving through the corridor. Refineries on the Gulf Coast that rely on Venezuelan heavy crude either pay more for shipping or they source from more expensive alternatives. That cost flows to diesel, heating oil, and gasoline. You're looking at noticeable increases at the pump within 30 to 45 days, and because diesel drives freight costs, grocery prices tick up over 60 to 90 days. Path 2. Stabilization through quiet deconfliction. The U.S. and Russia, through back channels, establish unwritten rules. The U.S. limits interdictions to specific targets. Russia quietly shifts flagging and routing away from contested lanes. Both sides avoid escalatory moves. The trigger, a pause in seizures combined with diplomatic signaling. If there are no additional interdictions in the next 10 to 14 days, and if Russian officials tone down the rhetoric, that suggests deconfliction is happening. The measurable signal, registry behavior. Watch for tankers sailing under Russian flags to switch to neutral registries like Panama or Liberia. Watch for routing changes. If those patterns emerge within 2 to 3 weeks, quiet deconfliction is working. The consequence for Americans? Stabilization, but no relief. Prices stop rising, but they don't fall. The risk premium that got priced in stays priced in because the underlying tension remains. Path 3, counterpressure and escalation. Russia decides that accepting the seizures sets a bad precedent. It begins shadowing tankers with naval assets. It makes close passes on U.S. enforcement vessels. It issues public statements that it will protect commercial shipping. The trigger, Russian naval or air presence. If you see reports of Russian warships or aircraft operating near tanker routes in the Caribbean or southern Atlantic, this path is starting. The measurable signal, incident reporting, and insurance exclusions. Watch for any reports of close encounters between U.S. and Russian military assets at sea. Watch for insurers to issue exclusions or cancel coverage entirely for Atlantic routes. If major underwriters pull out, shipping freezes. The consequence for Americans, severe cost escalation. If insurers won't cover Atlantic oil shipments, capacity collapses. Refineries scramble for alternative supply. Oil prices spike. You're looking at significant increases at the pump in a matter of weeks. Heating oil and diesel follow. Freight costs explode. Inflation reaccelerates. If you're on fixed income, your purchasing power takes a serious hit. So what do you watch? First, Watch for additional seizures. Any reports of more tanker boardings in the Atlantic or Caribbean are critical. Second, watch for changes in registry and flag behavior. If you see tankers switching from Russian flags to neutral flags, that's deconfliction. Third, watch for insurer language shifts. If you see new war risk premiums or exclusions for Atlantic routes, that's the market telling you risk is rising. Fourth, watch for Russian signaling. Any Russian official statements about escorting commercial vessels or reports of Russian naval activity in shipping lanes are signals of escalation. Fifth, watch for changes in sanctioned trade routes. If tankers start rerouting around the Caribbean entirely, the corridor is being perceived as too high risk. And finally, watch the price signals. If you see oil futures tick up consistently, if diesel and heating oil prices at the wholesale level rise faster than crude prices, if freight rates for oil tankers spike, all of those are leading indicators that the market is pricing in the consequences of this week's seizures. The spectacle is a Russian-flagged tanker in U.S. custody, Moscow calling it piracy. Headlines about confrontation. The ledger is frozen cargo, insurance underwriters repricing Atlantic risk, shipowners pulling capacity from contested routes, and refineries bidding for more expensive alternatives. One is theater, the other is mechanics. And the mechanics are moving now. They price in risk immediately, and they pass that cost to you at the pump, in your heating bill, in your grocery total. This is about enforcement power in the Atlantic. It's about whether the U.S. can make sanctions physical and whether Russia will accept that or force the cost higher. And over the next 7 to 30 days, you'll see which path unfolds through measurable signals: seizures, registries, insurance, Russian moves, and price. Watch those. They'll tell you what's coming before it shows up in your wallet. Because this isn't speculation. It's logistics, jurisdiction, deterrence, and risk premium. And all of that translates directly into what you pay. That's the pressure point, and it's active right now.